Hi everyone. I recently learned the Pirc Defense, or Pirc Defense as some people pronounce it, from National Master Robert Ramirez, and I'm going to summarize some of what I learned. But please check out the links in the description below. You'll see some excellent videos by National Master Ramirez. All right, so let me talk about what the Pirc Defense is. Let me flip the board. I want to look at this from Black's perspective. So the Pirc defense is a defense to the e4 move, and Black plays d6 and starts the Pirc defense. The purpose of this move d6 is to make a stable square for the knight on f6. So d6 is stopping the e-pawn from pushing any further. Now here White usually grabs the dual pawn center. Black develops the knight and attacks e4. And White can make several moves here, but the most common by far is knight c3 to defend e4. And now since this dark square diagonal is blocked, Black begins a fianchetto with g6. Now White can play several moves in this position as well. Let's just take a look at one. Knight f3 is the most common. It's called the classical variation. And the point of White's move is to develop the king side quickly and castle on that side of the board. And Black goes ahead and completes his fianchetto. So what you're looking at here is a system, an opening system for Black. So Black is putting his pawns on d6 and g6, and his knight on f6 and bishop on g7. And he can do this against almost any sequence of moves that White plays. So that's why we call it an opening system. You don't have to learn a lot of theory. You know where the pieces go, you put them there, and you learn some middle game plans and some common tactical ideas. Okay, so continuing from here, a very common move that amateurs play is bishop to c4. It's a good move. It activates the bishop, hitting the f7 square. Masters tend to play bishop to e2 instead. Okay, here we can castle, and White can castle as well. And now there are two main plans for Black. Black needs to, at some point, strike White's center. You can't leave this pawn duo on here for too long. It will cramp Black. He needs space. So one way to address the center is to develop the bishop to g4. And Black is intending to give up the bishop pair. If White kicks it with h3, he'll trade it for the knight. The knight on f3 is guarding these central dark squares, and Black will hit them with knight to c6. And so that's how Black strikes back. Okay, another plan besides bishop to g4 is to push the pawn to c6. And in this case, Black doesn't want to give up the bishop pair, so he delays development of his light squared bishop. And instead, his plan is going to be to break in the center with an early e5. And that's usually supported by the move knight b to d7. And queen to c7 can also support that e5 pawn push. And that's one of the purposes of playing the pawn to c6. The rook typically comes to e8, and Black has plenty of support for his e5 pawn push. The pawn on c6 can also be used as a lever to expand on the queen side. It can support the pawn coming to the b5 square. In fact, White has to be careful of a common tactical idea of pawn to b5, and if the bishop were to go back to b3, then the pawn can go to b4 and displace the c3 knight, which is defending the e4 pawn. So Black typically gets some expansion on the queen side. Sometimes the queen may even go all the way to a5. So those are the two basic plans in this classical variation after knight to f3. Let's look at another way White might play this position. White may delay development of the king side and instead try to castle queen side. For example, he can play bishop to e3, and here the intention is to play queen to d2 and castle queenside. And then if black castles kingside, we'll have an opposite side attack here. And white will usually play f3, followed by g4 and h4, and launch a pawn storm at black's castled king. Now, if you see this plan involving bishop to e3 and queen to d2 and queenside castling, that's known as the 150 attack, and it's named that because British players claimed that this is a good attack for somebody with a British rating of 150, which is equivalent to an 1800 FIDE rating, and they claim that you don't need to know any theory, the attack should play itself. Another way to launch this attack is to play f3 first before bishop to e3. The point of that move is to stop knight to g4 from harassing the bishop on e3. But many players have realized that playing the bishop here without f3 is fine. And black usually doesn't get much after knight to g4 anyway. All right, well, National Master Ramirez's advice is when you see bishop to e3 or f3, anything but the classical variation of knight to f3, you may want to delay kingside operations. You don't even necessarily complete the fianchetto, and you certainly don't want to castle on that side of the board and give white the target that they want. So instead, at this point, when facing this kind of aggressive move, he recommends playing c6. And the idea is to start working on the queen side and maybe push your queen side pawns with b5 and a5. And this may dissuade white from castling on that side of the board. And as a result, black may be able to safely castle kingside after white does the same. Or you may have an opposite side castling attack, and black will have a head start by pushing his pawns just as white is pushing his pawns. Okay, another move in this position is the move f4. It's very popular. It's called the Austrian attack. So white gains this massive pawn center, controlling all of these squares in front of his pawns. In this case, black needs to strike that center with a pawn move quickly, and National Master Ramirez recommends the move c5 in a timely moment. The typical way of playing here is to finish the fianchetto, and then by far the most popular response is knight to f3. And now one move is castling, but Ramirez recommends c5, striking the center immediately. Now, if the white player doesn't know the theory here, he may reason, let's take the pawn, because when black recaptures, we'll be able to get the queens off and displace the black king. But black is not intending to recapture in this position. After white takes on c5, his move is queen to a5, with the idea of pinning the knight on c3, which is defending the e4 pawn. So white doesn't have time to gain a pawn with pawn takes d6, which leads to a disaster after knight takes e4. So instead, what white typically does here is defend the e4 pawn, since the knight on c3 currently is not doing that job. The most common way to do that is bishop to d3 to defend that pawn. Then black can recapture the pawn on c5 with his queen. The queen is well placed, it's stopping white from castling, and normally players will play queen to e2 here with the idea of supporting the dark squared bishop, coming to d3, attacking the queen, blocking the diagonal, and then deciding which way to castle, possibly kingside. There's a lot of theory in this position we may explore in further videos. So those are the three main ways for white to play against the Pirc, and black should be aware of the middle game plans in all of them. And I want to mention just something else before we look at some master level games in the Pirc. As I said, the Pirc is a setup. Black can put his pieces on these squares against most anything white plays. This setup is very similar to another opening, the King's Indian Defense. The King's Indian Defense is the defense against the d4 move. Black typically plays knight to f6 here, or although you can enter it by transposition by playing g6 as Ramirez likes to play. And after knight to f6, white cannot immediately grab this pawn center with e4, so instead white typically plays c4 in this position. Okay, black continues to develop his king's side, intending to fianchetto the bishop to g7. And white normally plays knight to c3 to support the pawn coming to the e4 square. Black completes the fianchetto, white expands his pawn center, and now black normally stops the pawn from coming to e5, just like in the Pirc with d6. Although I will remark that there is a game that Bobby Fischer played, and it's in his book, My 60 Memorable Games, in which he castled in this position, and his opponent did play e5, and Fischer remarked that is an inaccuracy, and black gets a better game after the retreating move knight to e8. But we won't go into the theory of the King's Indian in this short video on the Pirc. So typically black stops that pawn advance with d6. Now you see the exact same setup that black plays in the Pirc defense against e4. The thing that makes this a King's Indian defense instead of a Pirc defense is the fact that white has the pawn on c4. In the Pirc, that pawn would be back on c2 and the knight would be in front of it. Now the knight is deployed behind it. And instead of a pawn to c4, white would have made one of those other moves like knight to f3 or f4 or bishop to e3 or even f3. So this is a King's Indian defense here. The two openings are very similar and sometimes they transpose into very similar positions. So if you are going to learn the Pirc defense, I would recommend learning the King's Indian defense along with it. And if you know those two openings really well, then you can play one or the other against almost anything white throws at you. So you can minimize your opening study. Now, one more thing I'll say about the Pirc before we look at the games is that I'm going to flip the board back and mention that you can play the Pirc defense as white a tempo up. It probably wouldn't be called the Pirc defense, but you can do the same thing. You can develop your pawn to d3, pawn to g3, knight to f3, fianchetto your bishop. For example, you can play d3 right away. Let's say black follows up with d4, or d5 rather, then knight f3. Then maybe this knight gets developed. You can push this pawn. Maybe black pushes this pawn to the center. You can fianchetto this bishop. And now black can try several things here. If black plays knight to f6, this looks like the classical variation with the colors reversed, but white has an extra tempo. If black plays bishop to e3, he's beginning some kind of 150 attack, probably, bishop e6, and probably wants to play queen to d7 and castle long. Or black can play the equivalent of the Austrian attack with f5. So you can play this with either color. So if you want a simple opening system to play and learn, you can try the Pirc defense. Now let's look at some master games. These are games that National Master Robert Ramirez has played, and they're featured on his YouTube channel. Again, I'll link them in the description below, and you can listen to his own commentary of the games, but I will summarize. So Ramirez is black, and he plays the Pirc. Okay, and they go into a classical variation with knight f3. So Ramirez completes his fianchetto, bishop c4, very common move amongst amateurs. Both players castle, and now Ramirez plays bishop to g4. Remember, there are two main plans here. You can give up the bishop pair in order to control the dark squares in the center, or you can delay developing your bishop, keep the bishop pair, and push the pawn to c6. So Ramirez often plays bishop g4. Okay, white provokes the bishop, black trades it off, and then plays knight to c6 to hit these central dark squares. Now, white does not want to split his pawns, which are sitting side, by playing the move d5. It just weakens the dark squares. The knight can hop to either square right now with good play, and white did not do that. Instead, white defended the pawn on d4 with his dark squared bishop. Now Ramirez strikes at the center with e5. Okay, white takes, and black takes back with his knight, forking the queen and light squared bishop. So the queen falls back to defend the bishop, and black takes the light squared bishop. So white no longer has the bishop pair advantage. Rook to e8, that's normally where that rook is going to go in this opening. And there's pressure on the e4 pawn, which seems to be defended adequately, but white misses a tactic. He plays rook fe1, and black takes the pawn, which seems to be defended. And you'll see the point if you don't see it already. White takes the knight, and then black forks the pieces with his pawn. Queen to b3 does attack a black pawn in return, but black happily takes the knight with the rook, activating the rook. He doesn't want that rook sitting behind a pawn, so he did not take with the pawn. Giving white the pawn on b7, this gives black a skewer, rook to b8. He's going to get that pawn and get a rook to the 7th rank. White does take one more pawn here. Black takes on b2. Now there's pressure on the long diagonal. White has to watch his rook. His pawn on c2 is hanging. So white moves his rook off of a1 and defends the pawn. d4 pushes the bishop back to defend his rook. Black takes the rook, and a couple moves later, white's bishop is terribly placed on e1. So black must have the advantage in this position. Okay, material is equal, black's pieces are more active. Queen to g5, activating the queen, hitting the rook on c1, putting pressure on the white king. There's pressure along the 7th rank by the black rook. White moves the rook to safety, and black takes the pawn on c2. So white is in trouble here. There's a lot of pressure on his king. He tries to get counterplay by pushing his a pawn, maybe trying to queen it. Okay, but black gets another piece into the attack. Bishop to e5 cuts off an escape square. And now bishop to b4 is an attempt to get more counterplay. White is threatening something like queen to b8 check. And then after the king moves to g7, you can play a piece to the f8 square with check. And so black needs to do something about this. This is a serious threat. And he comes up with an excellent move. He blocks the bishop with c5. It looks like that pawn is free to take, and white accidentally takes it and blunders. That pawn was actually defended indirectly by the black queen, as black demonstrated with taking the bishop, and then when the queen took back, bishop to h2 check, and then black picks up the queen and white lost. Let's look at a second game played by Ramirez, okay, with the black pieces again. Okay, so here's the Pirc Defense. So here white plays an unusual bishop to d3 instead of knight to c3. That's a fine move too. It defends e4. Black's plans should be exactly the same. He wants to fianchetto the dark squared bishop. Knight f3, this is like the classical variation, so white is not intending to expand with f3 and g4, so he's not going to play for a pawn storm on the king side, so it's safe to continue operations on the king side and castle on that side of the board. Rook to e1 was played, and now bishop to g4. Again, Ramirez does like this move bishop to g4 to eliminate that defender of the central dark squares. Okay, h3, black takes off that knight, plays knight to c6, just like we saw in the last game. This time, since the knight is not on c3, white has an extra option here, and he decides to defend the d4 point with a pawn, c3. So white's pawn center is looking very strong. So black has to attack it, and he does so with e5. This allowed white to lock up the center and drive the knight away. Once this happened, Ramirez was able to draw on his experience in the King's Indian defense to play from this point on. In the King's Indian defense, you often do get a similar pawn structure. Black's central pawn chain is pointed at the king side, and white's is pointed at the queen side. So black will play on the king side of the board, and white will attempt to get counterplay on the queen side. Black would eventually like to play his f-pawn to f5 to attack that pawn on e4, and likewise white would eventually like to push his c-pawn to c5 to attack the pawn on d6. All right, so c4 is played, which does give a square to the knight on b1. It can go to c3 now, and white is going to push his queen side pawns. Black plays knight f to d7. Both knights seem to be retreating, but those are only temporary retreats. Black's idea is to move out of the way of his f-pawn so it can go forward to f5. Knight to c3 was played, f5. Okay, there's pressure along the f-file. The rook is in line with the queen, so the queen drops back to d1, and now f4 is played, bypassing the e4 pawn, with the idea of launching the f, g, and h pawns all at the white king. f3 stops the advance of the f-pawn, g5, and now the g4 square is crucial. Black would like a pawn break. He'd like to push his pawn to g4, and he needs a lot of support to do that, including the pawn move h5. Now, it may look dangerous that black is moving all the pawns in front of his king like this, but that is generally safe to do when the pawns in the center are blocked like this, because white has no lines of play against the black king through this blocked center. Okay, white continues expanding on the queen side. h5 supporting the g4 pawn break. Bishop d2. Knight g6, bringing pieces over to the king side. Bishop e2 supporting that g4 square. Knight f6, so the knights are getting back into the game. The knight on f6 supports the g4 pawn push. a4. Rook to f7 is a typical maneuver in the King's Indian defense. The idea is to move the bishop out of the way and then put the rook on the g7 square. And the rook will be facing the white king, and it will be supporting a pawn push to g4. Okay, white finally makes contact here, pushes c5, attacking d6. Bishop f8 gets out of the way of the rook and supports the d6 square. White exchanges. Black wants to take back with the pawn, which he does because he needs to keep that center blocked since his king has no pawn cover. Rook c1, rook g7 as intended. The rook is on the g file. Knight b5 was a wasted move since both squares d6 and c7 are covered by black. White has no entry, so black just kicks the knight back. White wasted a tempo. And now the move knight to h4, clearing the g file so the rook has more pressure down the g file and bringing a piece closer to the white king. King h1 gets off of that dangerous g file. Now black would like to get another piece to support a pawn push to g4, and he plays the excellent move queen to e8, intending to bring the queen to the g file. a5, probably a wasted move, queen to g6, rook g1, trying to defend that g file, and finally black pushes through with g4. White tries bishop e1, attacking the loose knight on h4, and black makes a paradoxical move here. he defends the knight by pushing the pawn to g3. This seems to lock up all the pawns around the white king, giving the white king a safe shelter. However, black has plans of eventually sacrificing a piece on the h3 square, ripping open the safety. This generally happens in the king's Indian defense with a light squared bishop sacrificing itself on h3. Black doesn't have the light squared bishop, so he intends to use another piece. Let's see how he does it. Knight to a4 was played. Knight h7. That's the piece black is going to use. It's going to go to g5 and then at the right moment sack itself on h3. Knight b6 attacks the rook. It's funny that the engine says that black can actually ignore that attack and lose the rook. He doesn't need it to win this game, but he saves it nevertheless just in case his attack doesn't break through and win him the game. Rook to c8, black trades rooks, then plays knight to g5, continuing on his journey to sacrifice on h3. Now knight to b6 was a blunder according to the engine. The only move that could possibly hold against black's attack apparently was bishop to f1. Okay, black sacrifices, white takes the knight, and now black has a checkmate in 3. If you'd like to try to find the checkmate in 3, pause your video. Okay, black plays g2 check, and if the rook takes, queen takes g2 as mate, so the king comes forward, and now a nice queen sacrifice with queen to g3 check. The only legal move is to take it with the bishop, but then we have a nice pawn mate on g3. Let's look at one last game played by Ramirez. Again, he's going to play the Pirc defense against e4. Bishop d3, again we see defending the e4 pawn. g6, knight f3, bishop g7. Both players castle. And now white plays h3. This is another option white has. He stops black's plans of playing bishop to g4. So Ramirez reverts to the other plan in this type of position. He plays c6. So his idea is to make a pawn break e5, and to accomplish that, the knight on b8 will go to d7 to support the pawn push. The queen typically goes to c7, which also supports the e5 point, and the rook usually comes to the e file. Okay, c3 is played, knight b d7, rook e1, and after rook e1, white is threatening himself to push his e-pawn to e5, and black cannot allow that to happen, so now is the time to push the pawn to e5. Knight b d2, queen c7, the pieces are going to their natural squares. Knight f1, probably intending to go to g3, rook e8. Now notice at no time does black want to take the pawn on d4 because the c-pawn would recapture and white's pawn center would be hard to break. a4, black blocks the a-pawn, queen c2, and now black takes advantage of the fact that white never placed a knight on c3 to defend the d5 square, and when you see that knight missing, you sometimes have this move available, d5. So we're going to get a lot of trades here. E takes d5, black takes back with the knight rather than the pawn, so as not to get an isolated queen's pawn. D takes e5, the knight recaptures, white takes back with the knight, and now you don't want to take back with your bishop and place your bishop in a pin, so you take back with the rook. The rooks get exchanged, the queen comes to the center of the board, white activates the knight to e3. Now black should not take that knight because white would recapture with his c1 bishop, activating his bishop, so that only helps white develop. So instead, black develops his last remaining minor piece, and white takes and activates black's bishop. So black's pieces are a little more active than white's. Black still needs to develop his last bishop and get his rook into the game. Meanwhile, black's rook has free range. So black has a slight edge. Bishop e3 was played, rook e8, rook e1, placing the rook in line with black's queen, so the queen steps aside. The queen wants to remain on the king side of the board for a possible attack. Bishop e2 attacking the queen, queen h4. Bishop f1, revealing the power of the rook. Bishop e5, and black's bishops are raking across the king side, and white looks like he's in a bit of trouble here, and he cracks. He blunders with bishop to d4. At first glance, that looks like a good move because it simultaneously attacks the bishop on e5 and pins it, since if it moves away, the rook on e8 is lost. However, it's a blunder because of a very simple tactic, a discovered attack with bishop to h2 check, revealing an attack on the white rook. King takes, rook takes, bishop e2, and at this point, black found a very nice checkmate in 3 moves. He sacrifices the rook, takes on h3 with the queen since the g2 pawn is pinned, and then mates on g2, a typical mating pattern. However, going back to this position, it was remarked by Ramirez that he missed a mate in 2. So if you'd like to try to find a mate in 2 rather than 3 in this position, go ahead and pause the video and give it a try. The mate in 2 he missed was queen to f4 check. The only legal move is to block it with the pawn, and then the rook mates on h1, thanks to the help of the bishop. All right, I hope these games and this introduction help you understand what the Pirc Defense is. I really like it a lot. I learned a lot about it from National Master Robert Ramirez. And the reason I like it so much is because you don't have to learn a lot of exact theory in most cases, and you do get to use a lot of strategy. You do have a lot of middle game plans to learn, a lot of master games to look at, a lot of typical tactics to become acquainted with. All right, thanks for watching.